Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Limud Live with the South African Jewish Report. And welcome to this really interesting session that we're going to be hosting with our presenters, Thembekile Mulaudzi and Carolyn Raffaeli. We welcome you all to engage in our sessions with the Limud values in mind, in particular the Limud values of respect and arguments for the sake of heaven. We're also here to build connections, which is another Limud value. So what we would suggest is that please, if you've got questions or comments for either of the presenters during the session, please post them in the chat box. And then at the end of their session, we'll pose some of those questions to you. We would also invite you, as some of you have been doing, to connect with one another in the chat box. We've got some ideas of where people are coming from and joining us from tonight. But just generally, if you see someone that you know, a name that you want to connect with, feel free to do so in the chat box. That's very much in line with our Limud values. So while we're just before we prepare to actually start the session, just a few things to note. One thing is, please note that the session is being recorded. That's both for security purposes, but also so that we can be able to share this really interesting and important content with other people who weren't able to be here or who might be in one of the other sessions now. And then something that we would ask that makes things, again, much more in line with the Limud values and the atmosphere that we try to create at Limud is, if you can and you haven't yet, please put your Zoom video on so that we can all see each other. Just to give you an understanding of how the session's going to work is that we're going to be speaking to Thembekile and to Carolyn for about half an hour to 35 minutes, and then we'll have some time for your questions. So please, as things are being discussed, please, if you've got questions or comments, please again post them into the chat box. So again, just a reminder, because I see some people asking, this is room 2. And our two presenters this evening are Thembekile Mulaudzi and Carolyn Raffaeli. Just to give a short background to who they are, Thembekile was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment in 2004 for the murder of a policeman, a crime which he always swore he did not commit. Prior to this conviction, he worked as a Soshanguve taxi driver. Thembekile, we so appreciate you sharing your heart-rending story as you did at Limud in 2018. And we're grateful that you've agreed to again join us, this time online, to share your story with this audience. Now, Carolyn is a former Wits Justice Project award-winning journalist. She spent 9 years investigating human rights abuses and miscarriages of justice related to the South African criminal justice system. Carolyn, thanks so much for agreeing to join us tonight as a presenter. We know that you're a loyal Limud delegate. Thanks again to Carolyn and Thembekile for being willing to use this Limud South African Jewish Report event as a Zoom debut for their story. So I'm now going to hand over to them. And again, just a reminder, as they're speaking, please can you post questions in the chat box, which we'll then pose to them afterwards. Thembekile and Carolyn, it's over to both of you now. Carolyn, just a reminder before you talk to unmute yourself. Carolyn, I'm not sure if you can hear us. If you're talking, you're just on mute. So a reminder to please unmute yourself. We're just, unfortunately, as sometimes happens with online events, we're just trying to sort something out here. If you'll give us 2 seconds so that we can allow Carolyn and Thembekile to properly present their really interesting story. There you go, Carolyn. Thanks for joining us.
1 minute, please. Sorry, I'm having a problem.
No, we can hear you, so you're all sorted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes,
Hello?
I can hear you. Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Occasionally in life, you meet someone who shifts your perspective and changes your worldview immeasurably. I never expected to find that person behind the bars of Sonderwater prison. Yet Thembekile, a convicted murderer, has taught me some of my greatest life lessons about patience, perseverance, resilience, courage, and forgiveness. He's a remarkable man with whom I've been privileged to travel a long road from a South African prison cell to America and back. Our journey began about 5 years ago when I received a call from Sonderwater prison warder Levi Mpakani, who told me that in the 18 years he'd worked as a warder, nearly every prisoner he'd engaged with said, "I didn't do it," and claimed to be wrongfully convicted. But Levi said, Thembekile, sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of a policeman, was the first inmate whose story he'd ever believed. In my work as a Wits Justice Project journalist, I'd also heard many "I didn't do it" stories. But since Levi was the first prison warder to call me, I sat up and took note. While Thembekile was protesting his innocence, telling anyone who'd listen that he'd never committed any crime and that a crime had been committed against him, Levi conducted his own informal investigation. He scoured Thembekile's prison files and talked to his family, friends, and co-accused, who all told him Thembekile had been wrongfully convicted. I initially agreed to go to Sonderwater to meet Thembekile, not because Levi said he was innocent, but because he also said Thembekile had tried unsuccessfully for more than 8 years to obtain his trial transcripts, which he needed to appeal his case. It's a constitutional right. In addition, the Wits Justice Project had received numerous complaints about missing transcripts, and we regarded this as an issue with serious human rights implications. I'm very trusting by nature and apparently a bit naive, according to my husband, and not always the best judge of character. I have to admit, I took an immediate liking to Thembekile at our first meeting, and I agreed to help him find his transcripts. Intuitively, I agreed with Levi, and I had to remind myself repeatedly over the ensuing years that being Mr. Nice Guy doesn't mean you're not a murderer, and also that my gut would never provide exculpatory evidence. Prison is a parallel universe where absolutely nothing can be taken for granted. There's always a possibility you're being played and that the person you're dealing with is a charming sociopath. So I also needed the transcripts to decide whether to stay on Thembekile's case. Luckily for both of us, Thembekile's monumental struggle to prove his innocence against seemingly insurmountable odds, including torture, solitary confinement, and his prolonged transcript search, finally came to an end 3 years later. After spending 11 years behind bars for a crime he always swore he did not commit, the Constitutional Court overturned his conviction and sentence and ordered his immediate release in 2015. Thembekile's nightmare began in 2002 when a Mototolong policeman was murdered during a botched hijacking. 8 men were rounded up and arrested, including Thembekile and 4 unknown others. During 2 ID parades, the policeman's daughter, the only witness to her father's murder, fingered 4 suspects. Thembekile, an easily identifiable 2-meter giant of a man, was not one of them. During a bungled police investigation characterized by shoddy detective work, no weapon or gun residue was found. There were no other witnesses, no independent corroboration, no fingerprints, and no tangible evidence linking him to the crime. All of the accused pleaded not guilty, but all were convicted and sentenced to life by Justice Monica Liu, now Northwest Judge President. The only evidence implicating Thembekile was a recanted confession by a co-accused who changed his testimony 4 times and whom a full bench of the Northwest High Court subsequently described as a reckless liar. Central to his testimony was an astonishing claim about the alleged getaway car, a Toyota Cressida, in which the men supposedly traveled for about 90 minutes to the crime scene and back. How 8 grown men, including 3 unusually tall men, could have fitted into a Cressida still baffles me. Immediately after the men's 2004 conviction and sentence, they were admitted to Pretoria CMAX, where they were forced to strip naked and tortured by warders for no apparent reason. They were forced to squat up and down in front of women warders with their genitals exposed, shocked with shock shields and beaten. Later that year, when Thembekile was transferred to Kokstad's Mbongweni prison, designed to house South Africa's most dangerous criminals, he was tortured again and placed in segregated or solitary confinement for 4 years. When he began searching for his transcripts to appeal his case, the process proved almost as torturous. Though indigent inmates are legally entitled to their records at state expense, after a 3-year wait, Thembekile's family, with the families of 2 of his co-accused, managed to raise 18,000 Rand between them to pay private attorneys to find the transcripts. Another 2 years passed before these materialized, with more than half of the 1,023-page record missing, including the most crucial evidence. Thembekile began bombarding anyone and everyone he could think of with requests for help. He even wrote to the Judicial Conduct Committee accusing Judge Liu of unethical misconduct. When he discovered his docket had also disappeared from Mototolong Police Station, he complained to the Minister of Police. The docket mysteriously rematerialized, but the police refused to release it. So, with only grade 10 education under his belt, Thembekile spent his days studying the Constitution, the Criminal Procedure Act, and advising other inmates of their rights. Not even the prison psychologist believed his story. So, armed with only prayers, faith, and the courage of his convictions, he soldiered on, bolstered by an overwhelming need to prove his innocence and be reunited with his wife, Paulina, and young son, Mark, who was just 3 months when he was arrested. Witnessing Thembekile's distress, Levi decided to take matters into his own hands and contacted me. I'm a journalist, not a lawyer. I had no idea what a mandamus application was or a notice of motion, let alone what an appeal to the ConCourt or the Supreme Court entailed. It was Thembekile's job to educate me, and he patiently explained and re-explained the most intricate of legal technicalities. When I finally understood his point, he'd say, at last, now you're thinking like a lawyer. I think we made a good team. Under his guidance, I obediently set off in search of his holy grail. About 3 months later, just when I thought I'd hit a brick wall, I had an unexpected breakthrough in my local Woolies garage shop late one night. When I recognized a prominent legal personality whom I didn't know buying milk, I hesitated for a nanosecond before pouncing on him and asking his advice. A bit of chutzpah never harmed anyone. As a result, I contacted Lawyers for Human Rights the very next morning, and after shameless name dropping, persuaded the director Jacob van Garderen to intervene. Thembekile received his transcripts in record time. But yet again, huge chunks of crucial evidence were missing. Finally, under pressure from Lawyers for Human Rights, Justice Liu ordered his trial records to be retranscribed. Judge Liu, I later learned, was a former Lawyers for Human Rights board member. 3 weeks later, Thembekile was finally in a position to appeal his case, a basic right which had required a David and Goliath battle to attain. However, when this battle ended, another one began. At the end of 2012, Thembekile shuffled into the Northwest High Court to appeal his case with his legs in manacles and chained like a dog. He was pretty optimistic about the outcome, but his appeal was dismissed by a full bench. Excuse me. A subsequent Supreme Court appeal was also dismissed with no reasons given. When legal aid said they couldn't assist him any further, he simply roped in an ex-prosecutor fellow inmate to help him lodge a con-court appeal. This appeal was also dismissed. The court said no constitutional issues were raised and the case had no reasonable prospects of success. I remember thinking, whatever, I'm done. All these courts, including the highest court in the land, can't be wrong. I couldn't believe it was possible for the system to have failed Thembekile so badly, and I questioned him and my own judgment. There were many occasions when he phoned me from prison, and I had no idea how to comfort him, what to say, or if I even still believed him. It was also difficult to defend the rights of a man sentenced to life imprisonment for murder in a climate of fear fueled by South Africa's high crime rates. A home invasion in which my husband was held up at gunpoint by 4 armed men didn't help either. From the get-go, I worried about the fact that Thembekile had no alibi. I asked him repeatedly where he was on the night of the policeman's murder, and his answer was always, I don't know, I think I was at home with my granny. And I was like, how can you not know where you were? Why can't you figure it out? Sadly, his granny, who might have been an alibi witness, passed away during the trial just before he testified. My aha moment came when I heard Deirdre Enright, who heads the University of Virginia's Innocence Project, explain that the lack of an alibi might actually be a good thing, particularly in the case of someone who hasn't committed a crime. Who, she explained, remembers where they were a month or 3 ago, and Thembekile, a Pretoria taxi driver who was arrested 6 months after the policeman's murder, never kept a diary. Legally, the Con-Court was Thembekile's last port of call, but even after the court dismissed his case, he never gave up hope. Instead, he spent a lot of time on his knees. Eventually, his prayers were answered as a result of serendipity, fate, or divine intervention, when 2 of his co-accused, Boswell Mhlongo and Disco Nkosi, lodged their own Con-Court appeal. Having learned from Thembekile's experience, their appeal was based on a constitutional principle. Since Boswell and Disco also had no legal assistance, apart from a UNISA law student behind bars, the court appointed an advocate to represent them on a pro bono basis. Nigel Carpenter, a state prosecutor committed to the pursuit of justice, proved an added bonus. Carpenter told the court that the only evidence implicating Boswell and Disco were extracurrial, out-of-court statements by a co-accused which were inadmissible and unconstitutional. When he announced that an unnamed accused number 5 had been similarly convicted, Thembekile's life changed course in a heartbeat. 2 weeks later, the court overturned Boswell and Disco's convictions and ordered their immediate release. Unfortunately, this didn't mean an immediate jail-free pass for Thembekile. When it emerged that he was accused number 5, he found himself unwittingly mired in complicated legal arguments regarding the doctrine of res judicata, meaning in common parlance, you can only have one bite of the legal cherry. Since the court had already heard and dismissed Tembekile's application 2 years earlier, it then needed to resolve whether it had the jurisdiction to hear the matter again. It took a further 3 months before the highest court in our land decided that in the interests of justice, it would reverse its own ruling for the first time ever. Meantime, for 3 long years, Thembekile had cautioned me against writing his story, and I respected his wishes against my better judgment. When I visited him in prison a few weeks before his release, champing at the bit and furious about the injustice of his situation, he told me to calm down and be patient. God is never late, he said. When he eventually walked out of the prison gates with 11 lost years behind him and an uncertain future before him, he promised 2 of his other co-accused, Sampi and Victor Moyo, that he'd also help them prove their innocence. He kept his word and roped me in to help, but that's another long story. The end result was in March 2017, the ConCourt also overturned Sampi and Victor's convictions. So Thembekile's matter became a case of 1 murder, 1 judge, 5 wrongfully convicted men, and no compensation from the state. Though Judge Liu shoulders no consequence for the shattered dreams and lost years stolen from the 5 men she sentenced to life imprisonment, Thembekile harbors no bitterness towards her. In fact, he's told me many times with enormous magnanimity, to err is human. That is the measure of the man and his extraordinary capacity for forgiveness. Thank you.
Thanks, Carolyn. I'm just standing in for Ariella, who's been locked out of the room. I think we can ask Thembekile now to join you and share his story. Thembekile, I think you are you muted? We can't hear you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Thembekile Mlaudzi. Yes, I am. Can you hear me now?
Great, we can hear you. You can carry on.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Go for it.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you quite well.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Thembekile. Yes, thank you.
It's not you're not in a great position, Thembekile. Thembekile, you're in an area with poor reception. Is it possible to go somewhere where it's better?
My name is Thembekile Mlaudzi. I can say everything I want to in misery I've been through. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Thembekile, perhaps if you turn off your video, we might be able to hear you better without it. I think we've lost you. Are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, now we can see you and hear you. That's much better. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I start again?
Right, thank you. Would you mind?
All right. So my name is Thembekile Mlaudzi. I'm from Pretoria, Ga-Rankuwa. Before I can say everything, I want to thank the Lord for keeping me so strong from all the misery I've been through. In 2003, 18 February, I was arrested for the crime I didn't commit, and then I was introduced to some co-accused unknown to me, and then when time goes on, I requested the bail, and then before I could granted bail, I was told to go to an ID parade, and then during the ID parade, I was not pointed. Only 2 accused were appointed, and then the matter goes on until around March, and then in March, I was granted bail. All the time, all the proceedings, I was attending them while I was on bail. So during the proceedings, everything was manipulated, and then it was just a bungling investigation, and then the police manipulated the proceeding together with the prosecutors. There was no evidence linking me. There was nothing tangible linking me. There was no gun residue or any ammunition or any firearm that was linking me. I was not pointed out during the ID parade, and there was no witness that has that could witness against me. There was no one who can talk about me or link me to the crime. So I was only there for the crime I did not commit, and then I was only included in the confession statement of the one accused who was unknown to me. And the same co-accused, he recanted his statement before the court many times, that through 2003, 2004, until the presiding officer found that all of us guilty. We were 8, and then he found us all guilty and sentenced us to life imprisonment. On the 22nd of July, 2004, we were sentenced to life imprisonment. We were taken to Odi Prison, from Odi Prison to CIMEX Correctional Center. When we arrived there, we were stripped out all our clothes and shocked with electric shock, and then we were forced to make these sit-ups. They were searching us, and then we were tortured, and we were taken to the solitary confinement. So during the first week of the sentence, I wrote letters to the president of the country. By then it was President Thabo Mbeki. Then I was requesting for help, just for assistance, so that I can get my freedom back. The only thing, I didn't want him to come and assist me. Only I just wanted his intervention, because of I was serving life sentence for the crime I did not commit. So I got a response that the office of the president has no jurisdiction between it and the judiciary, and then it has no powers. The only thing I can do was to write an appeal. So I requested legal aid to assist me with my appeal, and then the legal aid told me that they were in financial constraint, and then I have to get the record. My family, the legal aid could not assist me with the records, and then I was told that the record they could not assist me with the record because they were in financial constraint, and then my family has to contribute the money so that the record could be purchased. So the money was purchased, and then by that time it was 2005. Then we were transferred to Kokstad eBongweni. When we arrived in eBongweni, we were tortured again and forced to strip out our uniform, and then we were tortured with electric shock. And then I wrote to the office of the president again, the office of the Minister of Justice, the office of Human Rights Commission, the office of Public Protector. All the respondents I got was only reluctant correspondences. They were reluctant to assist me. In 2006, around 2008, we were sent back to CIMEX, and then we were tortured again. All this correctional institution, while I was transferred to, I've been writing letters to different government institutions requesting for help. When I was sentenced, I left my son. He was almost a year old, and then when they come to visit me, I could not touch him because of he would see me through a glass, and then one of my hand was carved to the stone, that they made it as a chair, and then I was only using one hand, and then I would only touch the glass, and then you would touch the glass, and then it was so torturing for me. And then I had to request to the social worker to request for personal consultation, and then my request was approved. And then the first time I touched my son, it was a very, very, very terrific moment for me, because of all the years I've been missing him, never seen him. I was not there when he was on the first day to go to school. I was not there when he crawled. I was not there when he started to walk. So the years behind bars, when you are incarcerated, is very terrible, because of you speaking to people, and then they don't believe you. They cannot understand how come the presiding officer can found you guilty without evidence. So in 2012, I requested a prison warder to assist me, because I showed him some evidence that I've been writing to different government institutions requesting for help, and then they are reluctant to help me. The prison warder called the Vest Justice Project, and the Vest Justice Project, he founded Miss Caroline Raphael, and then she came and consulted me. Then I showed her the evidence, the correspondences, and then she requested the human rights lawyers for assistance. And then suddenly my record was found. And before that record was found, the one that we purchased, the record was incomplete. And then I could not appeal with it, because of the record was not authentic, and then there was no way that I can prove my innocence before the appeal court that I was convicted for the crime I did not commit. It was terrible and horrific, because of day and night I would cry thinking, which remedy must I use just to get my freedom back? Rain was not allowed to rain on my body. I could not see the sky. I could not see the sun. I could not be with my family. I was crying all the time, and then I was depressed until I could not understand what was happening with my life. Sometimes while I was incarcerated, I would bedwet, and then I could not feel when did I wet the blankets. But when I wake up, I will find out my bed is wet, and then I did not know when did I pee. And that thing has tortured me. All the inhuman, the degrading that happens to me, I could not do to anyone. So in 2012, when I went to the Mafikeng High Court, I was granted to leave to appeal, and then the full bench dismissed my appeal. The Supreme Court dismissed my appeal. The Constitutional Court dismissed my appeal. I was only released in 2015. All the inhumane, the treatment, it has been tortured, the torturing, it has been tattooed on my brain. All the time, I cannot stop thinking of it. Now and then, I'm still thinking of it. My son was raised without a father figure. When I would call him, he will ask me, when am I coming back? And then I will say, soon I will be back. Each and every year, I would promise him I'm coming soon. He end up saying, no, Daddy, you always lie to me. I don't trust you anymore. I don't have hope that you are coming. You are lying to me. So I kept my faith on. I kept on nagging God. I kept on praying, and I was competent in praying. And then I keep on consistently praying that one day God will answer my prayers. So it happens that in 2015, when my co-accused was out, my matter was re-enrolled again, reheard in the Constitutional Court, and then I got my freedom in 2015 on the 26th of June. So my first day to see the sky, it was the 26th of June, and then I was a very happy man on the whole planet of Earth. I was happy. In 2018, I was very fortunate that I fly to New York and then went to Memphis to meet some other exonerees that were supposed to be executed. When watching them, I find myself as a very fortunate person because of they were supposed to be executed. I was serving life sentence. I was not promised to be executed. They were supposed to be executed and they were exonerated. So I look at myself and say, I was very fortunate. They were supposed to be executed, but with the grace of God, I survived. They survived too. So going to America was a blessing and a lesson for me because there were higher cases than mine. And then I have found that everything that happened in my life was a very touching and horrific. I don't have words to can express what I can say. It's very disturbing because of even now when I see a prison warder wearing a brown clothes, I just imagine of incarceration and
Hi, Thembekile. Unfortunately, it seems that we've had a problem with your internet connection, and we apologize firstly to you and also to everyone else who's joining us tonight. I don't know if you can maybe try connect again, and maybe in the meantime, just to assist us in processing what we've just heard from Thembekile. If Carolyn's there, if we can ask a couple of questions, maybe once Thembekile is back, we can direct some questions to him. But Carolyn, if we can ask you a question, what is your, we said in the introduction that you've spent 9 years working with human rights and the South African criminal justice system. And we're just wondering maybe if you can discuss what you think went wrong here with Thembekile. Where in his case, where in the system did it go wrong? Was it at the police? Was it at the magistrate side or in the appeal system that just didn't allow him to appeal in time? And Carolyn, if while you're considering that, I also just want to flag that you're apparently starting to write a book on the journey that you've gone through in meeting Thembekile and finding out his story, and then of course the journey that he went through in getting released from jail and having himself exonerated.
I think that this case is indicative of systemic problems in the criminal justice system, which is increasingly dysfunctional. And if you're poor, Black, and uneducated, it becomes even more dysfunctional. But in South Africa, we have no idea of the magnitude of the wrongful conviction problem because the National Prosecuting Authority nor the Department of Correctional Services keep records. So there are no numbers, but in America, there is an organization called the National Registry of Exonerations, and Thembekile's case has all the hallmarks and all the characteristics of what the National Registry of Exonerations in America has discovered are characteristic of wrongful conviction cases, and those, the leading causes of wrongful convictions are eyewitness misidentification, false or coerced confessions, false accusations or perjury, false or misleading forensic evidence, and official misconduct and poor lawyering. Also, things like informer rewards and prison snitches. And his case has all those hallmarks.
Thanks, Carolyn. I see that we've got Thembekile back. Thembekile, if you can, and if we'd really like to hear more from you. Just maybe to hear how you feel now, having gone through all of this, and now that you've spent, all of that time wrongfully accused, saying that from the beginning. If you can maybe tell us how you feel now about the criminal justice system, and if you are considering suing the state, if there's anything in the pipeline, or if you've negotiated anything with the state that you can talk about. Thembekile, if you're there and you want to unmute yourself to answer. Otherwise, if he's not able to, if Carolyn, if you're able to maybe give some indication there, and then what we can do if we can't get hold of Thembekile again is we'll post his contact details into the chat.
So there is no automatic compensation from the state for wrongful convictions. In some American states, there is, and people have been awarded pretty huge amounts. But Thembekile has tried, and his co-accused, some of them, have tried to obtain compensation. Unfortunately, the court case was about 2 days before lockdown, and it was postponed. They'd been waiting basically 4 years, I think, for the case to come to court. And well, it didn't, and we don't know when it will come back.
Thank you. So there is a process in place that hopefully, money is not going to compensate him for the amount of time that he's lost in his life and with his family, but there is a process in place, and I guess that's good for us all to hear. It seems that Thembekile is now back. Thembekile, do you maybe want to give some insights into how you feel about the criminal justice system now? Just remember to unmute yourself. Otherwise, it does seem that Thembekile's internet is just not working. So again, we apologize to him and to all of you, because I know that so many of us would want to hear from him. Carolyn, do you maybe want to explain what the book is? It seems that we might have him back. Yes, we can hear you, Thembekile.
Oops.
Okay, I think, Carolyn, we should maybe move on to the book, and if you just want to tell us what you're aiming to focus on in the book.
Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
So what was the question? There was very poor network. Can you please repeat your question?
Yeah, I'm sorry about this. We've got just about 2 minutes.
Can you please repeat your question?
I know that everyone wants to hear so much more from you, but if maybe you can give us an indication of
can you please repeat your question?
In your life, how you're reconnecting, how you're reconnecting with your family, and how you're choosing to live out the rest of your life now that you are free. Okay, unfortunately, it seems like the internet is just not working here. We're so sorry about this. Carolyn, if you can just mention the book and tell us why you thought to write a book on Thembekile's story and the process that you've gone through with him.
I want to write a book because it's such a horrific and tragic story. And as I was saying earlier, there are no, we don't have any stats on wrongful convictions in South Africa. We have no idea of the magnitude of the problem, but I do know from anecdotal evidence that this case is just the tip of the iceberg. And I know that because of letters and phone calls and connections that people made to the Wits Justice Project while I was there. And so, you know, there's no reason why South African prisons should be different from American prisons. And I think to date, there have been 2,600 and something exonerations in America since the establishment of the Innocence Movement. And you know, there are a lot of people languishing in South African jails who shouldn't be there. And I think it's very important for the public to know this, especially in a climate, you know, South Africa has rocketing crime rates and people generally, there are many people calling for the reinstatement of the death penalty. And I think it's also important, you can share very complicated legal concepts by talking about a terrible human drama and a terrible tragedy that has occurred. I think Thembekile looks like he's back.
Yes, it looks like, no?
Thembekile, we have just 2 minutes left. Can you hear us? Because I know that everyone would love to hear from you. Just a final word, if you can hear us.
Oops.
Okay, it unfortunately just doesn't seem like he can. What I would say is firstly, again, to apologize, most importantly, to Thembekile, who's shared his really heartrending story with us. And I know that we would have preferred to have been able to have better contact with him and to hear the end of his story and how he feels going forward. But just to really thank him for sharing himself on this platform, and to thank Carolyn for also sharing from her side the story, and I'm sure we'd all agree for getting involved and doing the work to assist Thembekile in this way. And I guess you would all join me in wishing him the very best of luck for the rest of his life going forward. What I will say for now is that I'm going to post in the chat. We're now all going to return to the webinar. I've put the Zoom link as well as the YouTube link into the chat box. If you could all click on there to go back to the central room to give an indication of who the next hour of speakers will be. But we really thank you all for joining us. What we would ask maybe to give an indication of how you felt about that session and the sharing from both Thembekile and Carolyn. If you want to do some jazz hands to show your appreciation, there's a reactions button at the bottom. You can put a thumbs up or a clap. I think it's a really wonderful way that this platform allows us to show our appreciation. But otherwise, thank you so much. I can see people posting and thanking both of you for sharing yourselves. And thank you to everyone for joining us, and apologies again for the technical difficulties. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Right, so it is now almost 9:40, late at night on a Saturday night. So while we wait to start, I just want to remind you of Limud's next eLimud event on the 25th of October, and I hope we're going to see you all there. Right, welcome back everyone to Limud Live in the South African Jewish Report and the SS Officer's Armchair in Search of a Hidden Life. My name is Jocelyn Rowan and I'm your host for the session. And as this is online, we still would like people to participate by posting questions in the chat, bearing in mind our Limud values of respect and arguments for the sake of heaven. And please note this session is being recorded, so you do have it for security purposes and you will have an opportunity to see the videos afterwards. It gives me enormous pleasure to introduce our presenters for the session, Daniel Lee and Tali Nates. Daniel is a historian of World War II and an expert on the history of Jews in France and North Africa during the Holocaust. Daniel will launch his widely anticipated book, The SS Officer's Armchair, which is a remarkable account of daily life in the Third Reich based on documents that were found concealed in a simple chair for 70 years. The minute we heard about this, we knew that Daniel had to launch this book at Limud and the South African Jewish Report Saturday night event. Daniel, thank you so much for joining us. We are sure that many people will want to buy this book after the presentation. And tonight, Daniel will be in conversation with Tali Nates, who is well known to our community. Tali is the founding director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. She's a Limud veteran and was a driving force as a volunteer and presenter in the early years of Limud South Africa, and remains one of the more popular local presenters we have. Tali, tonight you make history. You're the first presenter who has done 2 eLimud events. Welcome. We'll have a 40-minute presentation and 5 minutes of the chat. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn. It is wonderful to be with all of you tonight and to have the official launch of this amazing, amazing book, The SS Officer's Armchair. And Daniel, it's wonderful to be in conversation with you. And as I said before in the teaser, you know, I could not put the book down. I read it in preparation of our conversation, and I just thought, what a wonderful, wonderful book. It is really a detective work, you know, it's a thriller at parts that I was waiting to see what will you discover. Your amazing research across Europe and the United States, tracing people, tracing homes, streets, and finding family members out of almost nowhere. It was absolutely amazing. And of course, your fantastic imagination to fill in the gaps in the story using other sources such as soldiers' letters from the front, or diaries, or just filling up the history of the Third Reich, history of anti-Semitism, early anti-Semitism, racism in the United States, and a lot of research that went into this amazing, amazing book. Now, as you said in the teaser, when we think about perpetrators during the Holocaust and the Second World War, we tend to think about, of course, the leaders, Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, or other desk killers that are very familiar to us, Adolf Eichmann, Hans Frank, or, you know, as someone very deeply in the history of the Holocaust, of course, we think of the genocide through the commanders of camps, or the Einsatzgruppen heads, concentration camp guards. You know, this is sort of what we think when we think about the Holocaust. So we're not surprised to hear the story of Franz Stengel for Treblinka, or Rudolf Höss from Auschwitz, or even Ollendorf from the Einsatzgruppen. But we do not know the ordinary Nazis. We do not know the smaller ranking party members, SS, people that belong to the SS or the Gestapo, names that we know, but we don't know much about. So your story is unique as it tells a story of an unknown person to all of us. And actually, if you guys, all 300 of you, Google the name of Robert Griesinger, you will not find him because he was not known until this book. So this is his story, and it is the story that you uncovered through your research over the years. So to start, Daniel, can you tell us a little about yourself and how you stumbled upon this story and then wrote this book?
Thank you so much, Tali. That was an extremely generous introduction, and I'm touched by all the wonderful things you've said about my book. So that means a lot. So thank you. So yeah, I'm a British historian of the Second World War. My last book was on Jews in Nazi-occupied France. So I'm a French historian by training, and I'm also interested, and I've written about the Jews of North Africa during the Second World War. So to answer the question about how and why I decided to write about this one guy, essentially the story came to me. I was living in Florence doing research there, and one day somebody just came up to me and said, "Oh, I've heard about you. You're a historian of the Second World War. I need your help. Something just happened to my mother." And I was just thinking, God, how extraordinary. You know, how could something have just happened to your mother? You know, anyway, and she just went on to explain how her mother had purchased this old armchair in the 1960s. She was a student. She was living in Prague. She was Czech. And she basically had went to a few thrift stores in Prague. She didn't have much money. She just got a few objects, including this armchair. And then when the family were allowed to leave communist Czechoslovakia in the 1980s, they could take certain objects with them when they migrated to the Netherlands. And so they took this chair, they'd had the chair for years. And then just a few years ago, having had the chair for almost 50 years, she decided to get it reupholstered. And that's when the reupholsterer discovered inside the cushion of the armchair, all of these documents covered in swastikas, all belonging to one man, Robert Griesinger. And she had no idea how the documents ended up in her armchair. She had purchased the chair. It wasn't a relative or anything like that. So she just brought them to me and she said, well, who is this man? And how on earth did his documents end up inside my armchair? So that's how I got into this story. I just, as you said at the beginning, I Googled him, I went online, I just tried to find out in a few books, whatever I could about this man. And there was just absolutely nothing. You know, as you say, we know so much. There's been so much written about the men at the top, the people, you know, Hitler, Himmler, Heydrich, etc. But when we start to really look for the people who actually, the millions of nameless, faceless followers. Oh, thank you, Ariella. So here's a photo we have of the chair itself. And then, so it's a very ordinary 1930s armchair. That's the bedroom in which it was discovered. The documents all sewn into the cushion. And then the next image we have is one of the documents which I've chosen to show you tonight, which shows straight away who this man was, a couple of things that I found interesting about him. Perhaps we'll see that in a moment.
And Daniel, maybe can you tell us about the reaction of the upholsterer in Amsterdam? Because so interesting.
For an upholsterer in Amsterdam, this isn't something that they discover every day. So he was genuinely shocked and actually quite appalled by the documents that he had all of a sudden in his fingers. You know, he thought that this woman was the daughter of a Nazi or a relative or had inherited this chair or something like that. And he accused her of, you know, oh, I don't do work for Nazis or their family. What is this? You know, you're a Nazi or whatever, something like that. She was genuinely flabbergasted. She had absolutely no idea who this man was or how his documents ended up in the chair. And from looking at this document, as I said, these were the most personal, deeply private identity papers, the kinds of thing you could not live without. The first document was dated from 1933 and the last one from 45. So again, what I did was I went to the archives in the Czech Republic, in Prague, and I just began digging. I wanted to know everything I could about this man and about his armchair.
Absolutely, and all those documents that he we assume hid in that armchair, but we'll get there. How did the story unfold and what did you find out is really fascinating. So this Robert Griesinger, that, as you said, you never heard of, was born in Stuttgart in 1906, and he died on the 27th of September 1945 in a hospital in Prague. Now, I would like to explore with you this man, his career in the SS, in the Gestapo, his serving in the Wehrmacht, in Poland and the Ukraine, and finally, his posting in Prague in the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia in the Ministry of Economics and Labor. And I would like to do it because we can spend 3 hours, 5 hours on this, but we sadly have only 35 minutes or even less. So let's do it through the prism of his links to the targeting of the Jews in Nazi Germany. But let's start maybe by speaking about his family background and some of the conservative and anti-Semitic views his family and he himself held, and how is his story connected to the history of racism, specifically about his family's roots in New Orleans in the US.
Yeah, no, I'm pleased you've mentioned that. Actually, Ariella, if we could possibly go to the next image, that would be really helpful. Because the point I want to make about Griesinger in relation to this question is that he came from a very, very middle-class family. He was what a lot of historians now see as being very typical of a member of the SS, this middle-class, university-educated, often with a PhD, Protestant background. So he sort of had all of these attributes. He ticked every box for membership of the sort of the typical SS member. But no, it was extremely surprising to me. Okay, so here what we see is a photo of his mother's diary. One of the most amazing sources I managed to find was his mother's diary. She wrote every single day in her diary, and she often included photos and newspaper extracts that she found interesting. So here's just, you know, a glimpse of what, you know, the young middle class, upper middle class family would have looked like at that time. So what was amazing when I discovered it was, contrary to everything I had thought I knew about Nazi Germany, that, you know, that Germans that Nazis had been in Germany for generation after generation after generation, Griesinger's father was actually American. Griesinger's father was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, and had actually moved to Imperial Germany at the late 19th century when sort of there was an economic slump in the US South after the Civil War and Reconstruction. And so Germany looked sort of much more, it offered more prospects for the family back then. So when tracing this family all the way back to the 1720s in Louisiana, what I kept finding was the multiple links his family had with slavery and the ways in which so many members of his family owned enslaved people. Even Griesinger's grandmother, who he was very close to, his grandmother Lena, she moved to Stuttgart with them. So she was born and bred in America, and she moved to Stuttgart in the late 19th century. And she grew up with an enslaved person in her house, for example. So what I'm trying to get at is that in the context of his background, the 1860s, the 1870s, this was a really important time for white supremacy, the emergence of white supremacy in the American South. And this was heavily interlinked with Griesinger's family. So when, for example, Griesinger's father decided to build a new house in Stuttgart, you know, I went to the archives, I got the plans of the house, and I'm looking at them in my hands because the house looked like nothing whatsoever. It looked like something out of the American South with all these columns and pillars at the entrance. It looked like none of the other houses in Stuttgart. And this is something that his father deliberately wanted. He wanted a reminder of his heritage from Louisiana. And then
yes, Daniel.
There was a second part of your question.
Yes, so maybe then he's born in 1906. What kind of young man, child was he? What was his background, the family, and maybe if you now can link to racism and anti-Semitism. So
yeah, so so he was born in this extraordinary decade, this decade between 1900 and 1910. And the reason that's such an amazing decade when we think about the Second World War and the Holocaust is that it was a generation which we as historians, we call the war youth generation. These were guys and obviously women, but the men who were later to join the Nazi party and rise through it had been too young to fight in the First World War. And the First World War was something that totally marked them, because let's not forget, Germany had not been invaded. They didn't have to live under a brutal occupation during the First World War. A lot of these people, I'll get to this photo later, but a lot of these people who were children during the First World War, when the Allies suddenly won, when Germany was had to sign this peace deal, it was the collapse of everything that they had known, all the certainties of life. It was total devastation for them. It was something that just marked them forever, okay? And this was really important for people like Griesinger and of his class. It was, you know, the Jews, the communists, they had brought Germany to defeat in World War I. These were the things that, you know, they needed to fight against at all costs in order to build a strong and resurgent Germany once again. In terms of the Jewish population, it's interesting because as you say, he came from Stuttgart, but Stuttgart, it's not Frankfurt, it's not Berlin, it doesn't have a significant Jewish population. There were only maybe 4,000, maybe 5 total max Jewish people living there at the time. So Griesinger wouldn't have interacted so much with Jewish people, although from looking at his school records, we do see that there was a Jewish boy in his class at school whose family I managed to track down. So he did have some interaction at school with Jews, because of course there were maybe, I think there was something like 20 Jews in his entire school of 500. So very, very small amount, but everybody knew who the Jewish kids were. The Jewish kids, it said on the register what religion the children were. The Jewish children wouldn't have gone to the religious classes. So there was always, of course, it was always known who was Jewish at the time. But it's really at university. So from 1925 onwards, when Griesinger goes to Tübingen University, one of the most extreme right nationalist universities in Germany at the time. And that's when he gets really involved with some of these far right nationalist movements, hugely anti-Semitic, anti-communist, etc. And this is something that comes up time and time again in his mother's diary, the extent to which, you know, she's obviously of the right herself, but she's constantly commenting on her son's politics being even too right-wing by her tastes, which were extremely nationalist.
Absolutely. And of course, the photo that very briefly went about his famous scar, and that is also the university days,
Absolutely.
This masculinity, this manly class.
It was so important. So for Griesinger, in the very first photo that you saw of him, in his passport photo, he's got this scar on his face. And I was very struck by that. And I did wonder how he had gotten this, how he had obtained the scar. But it was really through looking at the records all of these right-wing fraternities in Germany at the time. It was, as you say, the sign of masculinity to have a scar. So it was almost, you know, to be encouraged that he would sort of pick up his sword and his opponent would have his sword. And then, you know, he would sort of like, you know, edge towards it. He would want some of his flesh to be torn from his face so that then he would get some salt and put the salt in the wound to appear, you know, much more manly. And this is something which was extremely common in right-wing societies, dueling societies, university groups in the 20s and in the 30s.
Yeah, and also it's something that is not spoken about much, you know, when you try to understand German society during the Weimar days, you do not talk about all those fraternities and the male universities that later you speak about, the other universities, not only Tübingen, but Leipzig and the other universities. Let's just move a little bit further when he is joining now the SS. The Nazis come to power. It is 1933, and Robert joins the SS in September 1933. And he actually rises to sort of mid-rank. He's never top rank is in the SS is Obersturmführer, that is his highest rank. But I would like you now to take us to the time when he's actually in the Gestapo, because this is something that we read about, but let's talk about his time in Stuttgart, in Hotel Silber, and talk about him. But now, Daniel, speak also about some of his colleagues, because it's really interesting what happened to some of his colleagues.
Yeah. So Griesinger is, he joins, as you say, he joins the SS quite late. He joins in September 33. And the reason that he joins quite late is because he probably hadn't been a member of the Nazi party. Well, he wasn't. He definitely was not a member of the Nazi party. As I've said, his class, his background, people like him didn't necessarily join the Nazi party. There were plenty of other right-wing anti-Semitic parties which he could have joined. So the Nazis for him might have been too rabble-rousing, too vulgar, or something like that at first. And also, let's not forget the Southwest, Stuttgart. It took a very long time for the Nazis to really take off there and to make progress. Even in the 1930 election, they had done quite poorly in the Southwest. So Griesinger probably did come to Nazism very, very late compared to others. That's why he joins the SS, because he's no longer able to become a party member. The Nazis decided in spring 1933 that membership was no longer afforded to everybody. So he joins the SS. As you say, he doesn't ever particularly rise up that high. But what's interesting tracing his career is like how he gets into these positions and when he gets into these positions, because it really is up to him the amount of involvement he chooses to invest in the organization. It's not as though he has to go every day or once a week. It's sort of, he decides how much, whether the level of interests that he invests into the organization. So it's not a full-time career for him. He's a lawyer, he's a civil servant. And in 1935 rather, he gets posted to the Gestapo in Stuttgart, and he works at this enormous building, the Hotel Silber, in the center of Stuttgart. And of course, in 35, 36, the regime is targeting Jews. I think had he by 33, 34, I think the Gestapo were much more interested in rounding up local communists, social democrats, trade unionists, etc. But by the time Griesinger joins in 1935, 36, that's when the regime is really looking at how to persecute the Jewish population in a way it hadn't done until then. So Griesinger joins this group of lawyers. They're all wearing ordinary suits every day to work. They're not wearing SS uniform or anything like that. And he is responsible, him and his group, for making sure that the laws are being carried out locally. Laws which were being decided in Berlin are being put into place throughout the entire state of Württemberg, so beyond Stuttgart. So Griesinger isn't necessarily going out, rolling up his sleeves and sort of rounding up Jews himself. But is he A, responsible for these atrocities, and B, of course, he knows exactly what's going on, because even though he's sitting at his desk with his nice typewriter on the second floor, there are all of these torture cells in the basement that everybody in Stuttgart knows about. Even when I go there and I talk to very elderly people, they're still scared of taking that street, of walking outside the building, the former Gestapo headquarters, because of the stories they had heard as children about what happened in those torture cellars. So what's really amazing is the way in which these group of lawyers take totally different trajectories, totally different directions from a group of 5 guys who were originally sharing an office in 1935. When we find the same 5 guys 5 years later, at the beginning of the occupation, the beginning of the Second World War, they are doing completely different things. And I would argue that Griesinger probably got the short straw. He is probably fed up with the job that he is doing then, and looking at his former colleagues who have advanced in the SS and the Gestapo and are doing all these exciting things. And he is just, all he's doing in 1940 is he's sitting on the border between France and Germany, waiting for war. He's an ordinary Wehrmacht soldier at that point. So the apple had really fallen far for him, and he hadn't taken advantage of a lot of the opportunities he'd been afforded.
And it's amazing because he's sitting there and implementing the Nuremberg laws, you know, in Stuttgart. And then his colleagues, those 5 lawyers, 3 of them are becoming heads in the Einsatzgruppen, the killing units that are, you know, actually the one is killing in Riga in Latvia, and a lot of the Jews, of course, from South Africa are from Latvia and Lithuania, and these are his colleagues.
That's fascinating. I hadn't actually thought of that connection until you're now, but you're absolutely right. So Walter Stahlecker, who he was extremely close to, Stahlecker even was a witness at for Griesinger's wife when she wanted to get married. To be an SS bride, you needed to have permission from the SS, and so you had to get all these people to sort of write about your personality and who you were, etc. So Griesinger got Stahlecker to be his witness for his wife, to comment on what she was like as a potential SS bride. And then 5 years later, 1941, Stahlecker is responsible entirely as the head of the SS squadrons invading Latvia and murdering the local Jewish population.
Absolutely. That for me was immediately, you know, the connection to South Africa and to our community. It was quite unbelievable. We're talking about the Jews. You mentioned the Jews of Stuttgart. He didn't know many Jews growing up. But in those years, 1936, when he is getting married after some months of trying to get married to Gisela, he lives next door to a Jewish couple, to Fritz and Helene Rothschild, that were quite Orthodox, observing Jews in Stuttgart. Tell us a little bit about them, and that is so close to this SS men, you know, that you are investigating. What did you find out about them?
Well, I wanted to know about how it would have been for someone like Griesinger just to be an ordinary Nazi and to live in Stuttgart. What did it mean at that time? And, you know, you could actually find everybody's names, even Stahlecker, someone as important as Stahlecker. You could pick up the phone book from Stuttgart in 1935-36 and still find his house. It was very, very easy. But Griesinger, so he got married in spring 1936, and he moved into this beautiful new house. And I just wanted to see it. I was very curious to see what it was like. And I checked out who was living next door at the time. I think Ariel is sharing a photo of the wedding day. So that's Griesinger in the middle with his new wife and the parents on either side. So yeah, I went to visit this new house because I'd seen in the archives he lived next door to a Jewish couple called Rothschild. And I was wondering, what does it mean to be in the SS, in the Gestapo, and to live next door to a Jewish family? Does it mean, you know, oh, maybe they're sort of 30 meters apart, the houses, or, you know, would there have been a big fence? I was just very curious in terms of space and geography to get my head around that. But lo and behold, when the family who owned the house today kindly agreed to let me in and have a look around, it was the houses were detached. There was just one wall separating the families, which was remarkable to me. And then I eventually managed to track down the granddaughter of the Rothschild, who was able to tell me more about her grandparents and the kind of religious life they would have had. The fact that they would have lit Shabbat candles on a Friday night, they would have had their mezuzah, etc. All of these signs that Griesinger and his wife and children would have noticed over the fence or just going into his house. The 2 front doors were practically next to one another. But that relationship could only last for so long. The Rothschilds left after Kristallnacht. Fritz Rothschild was rounded up. He was sent to a camp in Germany, and then fortunately managed to get out, and the couple and their son escaped to France, and they spent the war in Nazi-occupied France until the very end, when they were deported and sent to Auschwitz.
Yeah, and that was amazing that you managed to trace exactly what happened to them, that they went to Drancy and they were sent to Auschwitz, on what convoy they were sent just before the Normandy invasion, D-Day, and maybe share what happened. What did you find out? What actually happened to this couple and their son?
So the son had already gone into hiding. He hadn't been deported, whereas the parents, who were by then in their late 40s, and so it was very unlikely that they would survive selection, let alone the experience of incarceration in the camp. But nevertheless, I discovered that upon arrival, Fritz was sent to the gas chambers, and his wife, who was almost 50, nevertheless, obviously must have looked a lot younger, because she was one of the few Jewish women on that convoy train who was spared and who was sent to work in the camp. And so she managed somehow to survive. She survived Auschwitz, and she returned to Paris, and then eventually moved to London shortly after the Second World War. And she spent the rest of her life in London. And again, she was able to write a lot about what had happened to her and her husband and their life in Stuttgart in documents in which she later tried to claim reparations from post-war Germany. So I was able to piece together bits of their life through her own voice in the archives.
Yeah, so it's just amazing to see these two stories in a way, one next to the other. Let us move now to his time in the Wehrmacht, especially serving in the 25th Motorized Infantry in June 1941. So you spoke about the unit going to Lublin, seeing the ghetto in Lublin, and then moving to the Soviet Union, the invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. And I wonder if you can speak about that period, the period in Poland, in the Ukraine.
Of course.
Would you speak about also the Wehrmacht role in the killings, and
Absolutely.
maybe, just extend a little bit about that? And finally, maybe speak about your family, your Ukrainian family, and the connection.
Sure. So yeah, Griesinger, like I've said at the beginning, was not sent to one of these very elitist jobs during the beginning of the war. He was a soldier, but boy, was he resentful. All of his letters from the time, he's complaining, he's writing to every contact he had at university, trying to get himself promoted. He wants to be sitting behind a desk somewhere. He does not want to be getting his hands dirty as an ordinary soldier. So he spends 1940 in France, and then 1941, his unit gets called up and they're told to go east. Now, for them, this was extremely strange because, the Nazis had this wonderful pact in place with the Soviet Union. So none of these soldiers had any idea why they were heading east. A lot of rumors were going around at the time. A lot of them thought, oh, well, we must be going through the Soviet Union. Like perhaps we're going to mandate Palestine, or perhaps we're going to the British Raj in India. So a lot of these men, I can see from the sources, from the letters and diaries, a lot of these men went out and they bought books, translation books in Arabic and Farsi, because the last thing on their mind was that they might be invading the Soviet Union. This was a huge surprise for these men. It was only in June 41 itself, days before, that they actually were told that they were about to do this invasion east. So what we see is Griesinger and his troops headed east from Poland into Ukraine, and just the killing begins straight away. We see villages within a few hours of obviously Red Army soldiers, but then communist so-called political agitators and Jews being murdered by Wehrmacht soldiers. And this, again, it's something that for years after the Second World War, we were told that, oh, it was only the Einsatz group and it was only the professional killers that killed Jews. German soldiers, we were men, we had honor, we conducted a gentlemanly war. We were out to get the Red Army, not the local Jewish population. But again, fortunately, for the last 20 years, we've seen as historians how this myth is no longer holds, and that even in Griesinger's exact army unit, time and time again, I'm finding cases of his unit murdering the local Jewish population as they advanced east into Ukraine. And again, so you've alluded to this, I was very surprised that my family would have anything whatsoever to do with this story. As a professional historian, I try to write about history, and I didn't ever think that I would be writing anything about my family. But my maternal grandmother's father came to Britain from Ukraine, from a small shtetl. And, it never occurred to me that Griesinger might even, Ukraine is the largest country in Europe, for goodness sake. But nevertheless, looking at a map, charting his route towards Kiev, I just see his unit suddenly going through this shtetl from which my ancestors came. And so it was just amazing to see sort of what was going on in that shtetl at that time in July 1941, as the rain was sort of gushing down on his unit and they weren't able to advance, the kind of things that they were seeing, the kind of things they were taking part in on the ground as they passed the local Jewish population, as they interacted with the local Jewish population.
That was really quite shocking to see what they saw and to imagine that he himself is part of this, because he is there, and there is no doubt that he saw what was going on there. We don't have much time, so very, very quickly, let's just finally go to his last posting, because he's wounded, he goes back to Germany, and then his last posting between 43 and 45 is in Prague, in the Ministry of Economics and Labor.
Right.
And you speak about this period as the one when he is the closest to be a Holocaust perpetrator. And maybe speak to us a little bit about his family,
yeah,
who is with him in Prague, and what does he do?
I mean, Prague was his #1 choice. It was such a dream posting to be sent to Prague at the beginning of 1943. By that time, bombs had started dropping. The Allies had developed airplanes that could carry bombs to the south of Germany. So Germany was being bombed at that time, whereas Prague was still this beautiful city with German history, German culture, theater, cinema, etc. So for him to be able to get a place for himself and his family in Prague would have been a dream come true for him. And that's when he was really able to sort of sit back and think, gosh, I've made it. You know, this is a city for me and for the future, for Germany. So again, like I've said, and we see in this photograph, he brings his wife, he brings his children, the family pet. And he has a very, very good life there. The children obviously go to the best school, the best German schools. They have the best rations, etc. And Griesinger's working every day at the ministry. Again, he's a lawyer at the Ministry of Economics and Labor. And so a lot of what he's doing, and the archives show this very clearly, is he is in charge of making sure that Czech workers are being sent away to do forced labor for the war effort, either in camps in Bohemia and Moravia, or being sent to Germany and Austria in terrible, debilitating conditions. We see time and time again from the memoirs of the fear, the brutality that existed among these Czech workers by the time they got to these camps in Germany, as I said, being bombed every day by Allied airplanes. It was gruesome for them. But again, closer to home, closer to Prague, again, you're having forced labor camps for the local Czech population. By then, by 1943, almost all the Jewish population had already been either incarcerated in Theresienstadt or had been sent to killing sites, concentration camps in Poland. Nevertheless, some did remain, especially those who might have had one Jewish parent instead of two. And so these Jews would not have been sent, some of these Jews would not have been sent to the camps, and these Jews fell under Griesinger's auspices. A lot of these Jews were sent away to do forced labor in sites close to Prague, within 100 miles of Prague. And these were the people that Griesinger would have been responsible for, along with any other thing that went towards improving the war effort for Germany.
So we have just a few minutes, and I just found it so fascinating, the research that you did, the process, the connections that you managed to create, the surprising known personalities that are suddenly connected to the story. Friedrich Chopin suddenly appears in your book as connected to the story. Who would have thought, you know? Or von Stauffenberg, you know, the try to kill Hitler is somehow connected to the story. Suddenly you see Adolf Eichmann living in the same city and so on. So I want the listeners to go and buy the book because it is so fascinating. So maybe tell us, as a final thing, some of the interesting people that you met, and maybe speak about the daughters that you discovered.
So no, thank you for that. So what I
Sorry, Daniel, can I interrupt? We've got 5 minutes left.
Okay,
So
that's
if you can
perfect.
talk,
This
and
will
then
be
we'll
a
have
quick,
time for some
quick
questions.
answer. Thank you, Jocelyn. So yeah, to get any sort of texture in terms of the family into my book, I really, really wanted to know people who had ever spoken to Griesinger, who had known Griesinger. So it was very important to me to try and find any of these people. And what was, he had 2 daughters, both of whom married, and it was really hard to find them. I didn't know what their married names were. So one day I simply had to get the phone book, today's phone book, to Stuttgart and just phone every single person in the phone book with the name Griesinger, saying, oh, was he a relative perhaps? Until somebody said, oh yes, that was my father's brother. And so that's how I managed to get entry to the family. I met his nephew, I went to the house, and the nephew told me how to get in touch with the daughters. And so then I managed to meet both his daughters independently. One of them lives in Switzerland, the other one still lives in Germany. And throughout the last few years, I've been in a great deal of contact with them regularly, talking to them, interviewing them. And then often they would want to interview me, which as a historian was very, very humbling and very surprising. Often I'm the one asking the questions and then I will receive an answer to my question. But here we had this very strange dynamic that I would ask my question, they would respond. And then at the end, they would ask me a ton of questions because he had died in 1945. The girls had grown up without a father. And their mother refused to speak. There was this post-war silence that so many of you will know about in Germany from the late 40s into the 50s and 60s, where people refused to speak about the war. These girls did not have anyone that they could ask about what their father had done. So here we have a photo, for example, of Robert with his oldest daughter, Jutta, and his parents in his parents' garden in Stuttgart.
Yeah, and there were just so many amazing discoveries. And maybe now that we're going to the questions, maybe talk about the documents, the armchair, just as closing. And what is your theory? How did it get into the armchair?
So I have so many possible things to say, much of which is discussed in the book. So we have to leave people wanting a reason to look at it.
Absolutely. There are some questions. Jocelyn, will you take some of the questions? And
yeah, I think the one question is the one you asked, that everyone wants to know: who hid it there, how did it get there, and what happened. I don't know if there are any more that people want to put in the chat. But what a fascinating story of a side we don't often hear, that literally came out of the woodwork.
It literally came out of fabric and woodwork, absolutely.
Yeah, so people do want to know, how do we get the book?
So Daniel, is Book Dealers going to have the books? Can we send people to Book Dealers, to Vivian?
I believe so, I think Vivian's in the room, he could hopefully... hopefully tell us, but yeah.
Yeah, we try to organize it's from Penguin Random, I think.
Penguin Random House, South Africa, it just came out.
So I'm sure it will be available at Book Dealers, but most probably also in Takealot and Loot and, all the online shops. And I do urge you to buy the book. It's really, really fascinating, the way you as I said, found out all those missing puzzle. Do you know if it is on Kindle, people are asking?
Yeah, it's definitely available electronically.
The one question was, what kind of documents did you find, and how long did it take you to do the research from the time of meeting the young woman to meeting his daughters?
So the research took a very long time. It started off as sort of, perhaps I'll write, maybe a little article about this. It was never clear to me at the beginning. As I said, I didn't know anything about this man or of his life. I wasn't really sure at the start what it was exactly I was after. It was only sort of after pulling certain threads and seeing like the possibilities that were emerging before me, that I decided, okay, this is something I need to work on. And of course, you know, visiting archives in the Czech Republic, in Germany, in France, and then having to go to Louisiana to look for even more archives took some years. So overall, it probably took me about 5-6 years to do the research and to write up what I discovered.
Thank you. We are out of time, but I see Vivian Nudakin has posted that the book will be available from book dealers in Bluebird. And what a fascinating story. Thank you, Tali and Daniel, for sharing it with us. And just to remind you all, just for your reactions, let's give them a hand or a wave, because I think it really was very meaningful to hear this. And we look forward to seeing you all at Elimud in October. Tali is a great curator that works with us in curating Holocaust-related themes at Limud, and I'm sure we will have some very interesting things then too. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram and Facebook, and return to the webinar where we're going to have some more schmoozing and some relaxing and talking about this great event. Thank you all for being with us. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Tali, and have a good evening.
Thank you, Jocelyn.
Exactly. Thank you, Jocelyn, Ariella, and Daniel. Thanks.
Thank you,
And
Tali.
Ariella for sharing the videos. Thanks you. Thanks all of you. We have posted where you go back to the webinar. Is that correct, Ariella?